Okay, good morning. So I'm covering this book, Nuclear War Survival Skills by Cresson H. Kearny, with authorization from Skyhorse Publishing. We're going to cover chapter 6 today. I forgot to mention this in the last video, but I've mentioned it previously. Please feel free to, if you don't want to hear me narrate this book, please feel free if you'd like to pause it and read through it yourself. That's perfectly okay with me. This isn't monetized or anything. This is just kind of general public information I'm putting out. So please feel free to do that. That will not hurt my feelings at all. So, chapter 6 is the ventilation and cooling of shelters. This is another long chapter. There's a couple of pages on directional fanning at the end of this. I might include that in a different video when I cover the KAP and how to build it. We'll see how long this goes and kind of just decide at the end of this. But anyway, okay, without further ado, this is chapter 6, ventilation and cooling of shelters. Okay, critical importance. If high protection factor shelters or most other shelters that lack adequate forced ventilation were fully occupied for several days in warm or hot weather, they would become so hot and humid that the occupants would collapse from the heat if they were to remain inside. It is important to understand that the heat and water vapor given off by the bodies of people in a crowded, long occupied shelter could be deadly if fallout prevents leaving the shelter. When people enter an underground shelter or basement in the summertime, at first, the air feels cool. However, if most shelters are fully occupied for a few days without adequate ventilation, the floors, walls, and ceilings, originally cool, will have absorbed about all the body heat of which they are capable. Some shelters will become dangerously hot in a few hours. Unless most of the occupants' body heat and water vapor from sweat are removed by air circulated through a typical shelter, the heat, humidity, conditions will become increasingly dangerous in warm or hot weather. One of the most important nuclear war survival skills people should learn is how to keep occupied shelters adequately ventilated in all seasons and cool enough for many days of occupancy in warm or hot weather. Methods for ventilating with homemade devices and for keeping ventilating air from carrying fallout particles into shelters are described in Appendix A and B. Instructions for directional fanning, the simplest means for forcing adequate volumes of air to flow through the shelters, are given at the end of this chapter. It's the 2 pages that I was referring to, so let's see how long this goes. I might go into that. Making and using an expedient air pump. The best expedient way to maintain livable conditions in a shelter, especially in hot weather, is to make and use a large volume shelter ventilating pump. Field tests have proved that average Americans can build the expedient air pump described in Appendix B in a few hours, with inexpensive materials found in most households. The simple pump was invented in 1962 by the author. I called it a punka pump because its hand-pulled operation is somewhat like that of an ancient fan called a punka, still used by some primitive peoples in hot countries. Unlike the punka, however, this air pump can force air to move in a desired direction as a true pump. It was named the Kearny Air Pump, KAP, by the Office of Civil Defense following tests of various models by Stanford Research Institute, the Protective Structures Development Center, and General American Transportation Company. These tests confirmed findings first made at Oak Ridge National Laboratory regarding the advantages of the KAP, both as a manually operated pump for forcing large volumes of outdoor air through shelters and as a device for distributing air within shelters and fanning the occupants. See figure 6.1, which is on the next page. The air pump instructions given in Appendix B are the result of having scores of families and pairs of untrained individuals, including children, build and use this air pump. They were guided by successively improved versions of these detailed written instructions that include many illustrations. See Appendix B. Some people who are experienced at building things will find these instructions unnecessarily long and detailed. However, shelter building experiments have shown that the physically stronger individuals, usually the more experienced builders, should do more of the hard manual work when shelters are built, and that those less experienced at building should do the lightest work, including making shelter ventilating pumps. These detailed step-by-step instructions have enabled people who never before had attempted to build a novel device of any kind to make serviceable air pumps. So there's figure 6.1. The 6-foot KAP tested for durability at Oak Ridge after 1,000 hours of operation, during which it pumped air through a room at a rate of 4,000 cubic feet per minute, 4,000 CFM. There were only minor tears in the plastic flaps. All right, so, and this is in the laboratory. I don't believe that's an actual shelter, but anyway. Okay, the air pump instructions given in Appendix B repeat some information in this chapter. This repetition is included both to help the reader when he starts to build an air pump and to increase the chances of the best available complete instructions being given to local newspapers during some future crisis. The instructions given in this book could be photographed, reproduced, and mass distributed by newspapers. There's another video, by the way, that he does where they're actually interviewing him. He's talking about the homemade fallout radiation meter, and he talks a little bit about that also. I don't think it's in this book where they can redistribute it through the newspapers, but anyway, yeah, that's actually a pretty informative video. And there's another one about how to make that fallout meter as well, so I would encourage y'all to check that out. Okay. Figure 6.2 shows behind the girl a 20-inch wide of 36-inch high KAP installed in the entry trench of a trench shelter, which is right here. So yeah, it's right back here. Behind the girl is the homemade air pump that made it possible for a family of 6 to live in a crowded trench shelter for more than 3 days. Outside, the temperature rose to 93 degrees Fahrenheit. I believe that was in Utah. Okay, let's see. Oh yeah. The father of the Utah family described earlier had made the simple pump at home using only materials and tools found in many homes, as described in Appendix B. He carried the pump on top of his car to the shelter building site. The pendulum-like flat valve pump was swung from 2 cabinet hinges, not shown, screwed onto a board. The board was nailed to roof poles of the narrow entry trench extending behind the girl in the photograph. The pull cord was attached to the pump frame below its hinged top and extended along one trench wall for the whole length of the shelter. Any one of the 6 occupants could pull this cord and easily pump as much as 300 cubic feet per minute of outdoor air through the shelter and through the insect screens over both its entrances. Without these screens, the numerous mosquitoes in this irrigated area would have made the family shelter stay very unpleasant. During the 77 hours that the family continuously occupied their narrow, covered trench, the temperatures outside rose as high as 93 degrees Fahrenheit. Without the air pump, the 6 occupants would have been driven from their shelter by unbearable temperature-humidity conditions during the day. The photo in figure 6.2 also shows how the air pump hung when not being operated, partially blocking the entry trench and causing a chimney effect flow of air at night. There was a 10-inch space between the air pump and the trench floor, and the resulting flow of air maintained adequate ventilation in the cool of the desert night, when outdoor temperatures dropped to as low as 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Cool outdoor airflow into the entry and under the motionless air pump, replacing the body-warmed air inside the shelter. The entering cool air is continuously forced the warm air out of the shelter room at ceiling height through the emergency crawlway exhaust trench at the other end. This is lined up, yeah. When the weather is cool, a piece of plastic or tightly woven cloth could be hung in the doorway of a well-designed narrow shelter to cause a flow of fresh air in the same manner. Numerous shelter occupancy tests have proved that modern Americans can live for weeks in an adequately cooled shelter with only 10 square feet of floor space per person. Other tests, such as the one conducted by the Navy near Washington, D.C., during an abnormally cool 2 weeks in August 1962, have shown that the conditions can be difficult even when summertime outdoor air is being pumped through a long-occupied shelter at the rate of 12 cubic feet per minute per person. This is 4 times the minimum ventilation rate for each occupant specified by FEMA for American shelters, 3 cubic feet per minute. 3 cubic feet per minute is about 3 times the supply of outdoor air needed to keep healthy people from having headaches as a result of exhaled carbon dioxide. In hot, humid weather, much more outdoor air than 12 cubic feet per minute per person must be supplied to a crowded, long-occupied shelter, as will be described in the following section and in Appendix B. Maintaining endurable shelter conditions in hot weather. The Navy test mentioned above showed how much modern Americans who are accustomed to air conditioning could learn from jungle natives about keeping cool and healthy by skillfully using hot, humid outdoor air. While working in jungles from the Amazon to Burma, I observed the methods used by the natives to avoid unhealthful conditions like those experienced in the Navy shelter, which was ventilated in a conventional American manner. These jungle methods include the first 5 of the 6 cooling methods listed in this section. During 24 years of civil defense research, my colleagues and I have improved upon the cooling methods of jungle people primarily by the invention and thorough field testing of the homemade KAP described in Appendix B, and of the directional fans covered by the instructions at the end of this chapter. Even during a heat wave in a hot part of the United States, endurable conditions can be maintained in a fully occupied below-ground shelter with a simple pump, if the test-proven requirements listed below are all met. Most basement shelters and many above-ground shelters can be kept at livable temperatures in hot weather if the cooling methods listed below are all followed. Supply enough air to carry away all the shelter occupants' body heat without raising the effective temperature of the air at the exhaust end of the shelter by more than 2 degrees. The effective temperature of the air to which a person is exposed is equivalent to the temperature of air at 100% relative humidity that causes the same sensation of warmth or cold. Effective temperature combines the effects of the temperature of the air, its relative humidity, and its movement. An ordinary thermometer does not measure effective temperature. In an occupancy test of the crowded shelters when the supply of outdoor air was hot and dry, shelter occupants had been surprised to find that they felt hottest at the air exhaust end of their shelter, where the temperature reading was lower than at the air intake end. Their sweaty bodies had acted as evaporative air coolers, but their body heat had raised the effective temperature, a reliable indicator of heat stress. If 40 cubic feet per minute, 40 CFM per person of outdoor air is supplied and properly distributed, then even if the outdoor air is at a temperature which is typical of the hottest hours during a heat wave in a hot, humid area of the U.S., the effective temperature of the shelter air will be increased no more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit by the shelter occupant's body heat and water vapor. Except for relatively few sick people dependent on air conditioning, anyone could endure air that has an effective temperature only 2 degrees Fahrenheit higher than that of the air outdoors. There are exceptions to this ventilation requirement when the ceiling or walls of the basement or above ground shelter in buildings are heated by the sun to levels higher than skin temperature. In such shelters, more than 40 CFM of outdoor air per occupant must be supplied. However, if a shelter is covered by at least 2 feet of earth, it will be so well insulated that its ceiling and walls will not get hot enough to heat the occupants. Move the air gently so as not to raise its temperature. In the aforementioned Navy test, a high-speed electric ventilating pump and the frictional resistance of pipes and filters raise the temperature of the air supplied to the shelter by 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Under extreme heat wave conditions, an air supply 3 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than the outdoor air could be disastrous, especially if considerably less than 40 CFM per occupant is supplied, and body heat raises the air temperature several additional degrees. Distribute the air quite evenly throughout the shelter. In a trench shelter where air is pumped at one end and flows out the other, good distribution is assured. In larger shelters, such as basements, ventilating air will move from the air supply opening straight to the air exhaust opening, Persons out of this airstream will not be adequately cooled. By using one or more additional smaller KAPs, also described in Appendix B, fresh air can be distributed easily throughout large shelter rooms, and the occupants will be gently fanned. Provide occupants with adequate drinking water and salt. In extremely hot weather, this means 4 quarts of water per day per person and 1 tablespoon, 10 grams of salt, including the salt in food. Whereas few clothes is practical. When the skin is bare, moving air can evaporate sweat more efficiently for effective cooling. Air movement can keep bare skin drier, and therefore less susceptible to heat rash and skin infections. If the inadequately ventilated Navy test shelter, 34 of the 99 initially healthy young men had heat rash, and 23 had more serious skin complaints at the end of their sweaty 2-week confinement. Although their overall physical condition had not deteriorated. However, at sick call every day, all these Navy test subjects with skin complaints were treated by medical corpsmen. In a nuclear war, very few shelter occupants would have medicines to treat skin diseases and infections that, if not taken care of, usually worsen rapidly under continuously hot, humid conditions. Simple means for preventing skin diseases and infections, means proved very effective by jungle natives and by our best trained jungle infantrymen in World War II, are described in the Prevention of Skin Diseases section in Chapter 12. Keep pumping about 40 CFM of air per person through the shelter both day and night during hot weather, so that the occupants in the shelter itself will be cooled off at night. In the Navy tests, the ventilation rate of 7 to 12 CFM was not high enough to give occupants the partial relief from heat and sweating that people normally get at night. In a National Academy of Sciences meeting on protective shelters, an authority stated, laboratory experiments and field investigations have shown that healthy persons at rest can tolerate daily exposures to ETs, effective temperatures up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, provided that they can get a good night's sleep in a cooler environment. An effective temperature, 90 degrees Fahrenheit, is higher than the highest outdoor effective temperature during a heat wave in the South or in American deserts. Adequate ventilation in cold weather. In freezing weather, a below-ground shelter covered with damp earth may continue to absorb almost all of its occupants' body heat for many days and stay unpleasantly cold. In one winter test of such a fully occupied shelter, the temperature of the humid air in the shelter remained about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Under such conditions, shelter occupants should continue to ventilate their shelter adequately to avoid the following conditions: a dangerous buildup of carbon dioxide from exhaled breath, the first symptoms of which are headaches and deeper breathing. Headaches from the carbon dioxide produced by smoking. When the ventilation rate is low, smoking should not be permitted, even near the exhaust opening. Headaches, collapse, or death due to carbon monoxide from open fires or gasoline lanterns that release gases into the shelter air. Natural ventilation. Enough air usually will be blown through an above-ground shelter if sufficiently large openings are provided on opposite sides and if there is any breeze. But if the weather is warm and still and the shelter crowded, the temperature-humidity conditions soon become unbearable. Adequate natural ventilation for below-ground shelters is more difficult. Even if there is a light breeze, not much air will make a right-angle turn and go down a vertical entry, make another right-angle turn, and then flow through a trench or other shelter partially obscured by people and supplies. In cool weather, occupants' body heat will warm the shelter air and make it lighter than the outdoor air. If a chimney-like opening or vent duct is provided in the ceiling, the warmed, lighter air will flow upward and out of the shelter, provided an adequate air intake is open near the floor. An Eskimo igloo is an excellent example of how very small ventilation openings, skillfully located at the ceiling and at the floor level, make it possible in cold weather for chimney-like natural ventilation to supply 1 cubic foot, 1 CFM per person of outdoor air needed to prevent exhaled carbon dioxide from becoming dangerously concentrated. In warm weather, chimney-like natural ventilation usually is inadequate for most high protection shelters that are fully occupied for days. And in hot weather, when as much as 40 CFM per occupant is required, body warm shelter is no lighter than the outdoor air. Chimney type ventilation fails completely under these conditions. All right. Next page. Okay, shelter ventilation without filters. Get a drink of water. Okay. Numerous tests have shown that the hazards from fallout particles carried into shelters by unfiltered ventilating air are minor compared to the dangers from inadequate ventilation. A 1962 summary of the official standards for ventilating systems of fallout shelters stated, air filters are not essential for small family-sized shelters. More recent findings have led to the report by the Subcommittee on Fallout of the National Academy of Sciences on the radioiodine inhalation problem stated this conclusion. The opinion of the subcommittee is that inhalation is far less of a threat than ingestion, eating, or drinking, and does not justify countermeasures such as filters in the ventilating system of shelters. Recommendations such as those above realistically face the fact that if we suffer a nuclear attack, the vast majority of Americans will have only the fallout protection given by buildings and some expedient shelters. Consequently, how best is to use available resources must be the primary consideration when planning for protection against the worst dangers of a nuclear attack. Relatively minor hazards may have to be accepted. For unprepared people, inhalation of fallout particles would be a minor danger compared to being forced out of a shelter because of dangerously inadequate ventilation. The most dangerous fallout particles are those deposited on the ground within the first few hours after the explosion that produces them. Typically, these hot particles would be so large and fast-falling that they would not be carried away into expedient shelters equipped with low-velocity air intake openings, such as those described in this book. Nor would these most dangerous hot fallout particles be sucked into gooseneck air intake pipes or other properly designed air intake openings of a permanent shelter. It's not really lined up. Okay, that's better. For most shelters built or improved hurriedly during a crisis, it will be impractical to provide filtered air. The car over the trench shelter, pictured in figure 6.3, points up the overriding need for pumped air for occupants of crowded shelters during warm or hot weather. There's that. There's a guy lying underneath his car. They shovel a bunch of dirt into it. Looks pretty uncomfortable, but so pulling a small stick frame KAP to keep temperatures endurable for occupants of a car over trench shelter in warm weather. Enough air also can be supplied with a small directional fan, although more laboriously. What was that? Okay. So this simple shelter provides fallout protection about 4 times as effective as that given by a typical home basement. After the car was driven over the trench, earth was shoveled into the car and its trunk and on the top of its hood. At one end was a combined crawlway entrance air intake opening. At the other end, a 1-foot square air exhaust opening. Each opening was covered by a small awning. To keep loose shielding earth from running under the car and into the trench, the upper edges of the 5-foot wide strips of polyethylene film were first attached to the car with duct tape to the sides and ends of the car, about 2 feet above the ground. Then earth was piled onto the parts of the film strips that were lying on the ground to secure them. Finally, earth was piled against the vertical parts of the attached film strips. Okay, placing earth rolls, see page 150. Around the sides of an earth-loaded car provide better, more secure side shielding, but requires more materials of work. Inhalation dangers. Only extremely small fallout particles can reach the lungs. The human nose and other air passages can filter out almost all particles 10 micrometers, 10 microns or larger in diameter, and about 95% of those exceeding 5 micrometers. See reference 6, page 599. 5 micrometers equal 5 millionth of a meter or 5,000ths of a millimeter. Using a dust mask or breathing through cloth would be helpful to keep keep from inhaling large hot fallout particles, which may cause beta burns on noses, sinuses, and bronchial tubes. Many such retained particles may be swallowed when cleared from one's air passageways by the body's natural protective processes. As shown in figure 6.4, a relatively large particle, 40 microns in diameter, spherical, and with the end-like density of most fallout particles, falls about 1,300 feet in 8 hours. A dark-colored particle, 40 microns in diameter, is about as small a speck as most people can see with the naked eye. Most 40 micron diameter fallout particles would take a few days to fall from the cloud of a 1 megaton explosion down far enough into the troposphere to be occasionally scavenged and promptly brought to Earth by rain or snow, while still very radioactive. In 1987, however, most of the thousands of deployed Soviet ICBM warheads are 550 kilotons or smaller. See Jane's Weapon Systems, 1987 to 88. The stabilized clouds of such explosions would be mostly in the troposphere, and some of even the tiniest particles, though small enough to be breathed into one's lungs, would be promptly scavenged and deposited in scattered hotspots. Fortunately, most of the very small and tiniest fallout particles would not be deposited for days to months, by which time radioactive decay would have made them much less dangerous. Breathing tiny radioactive particles into one's lungs would constitute a minor health hazard compared to other dangers that would afflict an unprepared people subjected to a large-scale nuclear attack. So this was in a previous chapter also, this diagram, figure 6.4, stabilized radioactive fallout clouds shown a few minutes after the explosions with distances that spherical fallout particles having diameters of 40, 50, and 100 microns fall in 8 hours. Okay. All right, scavenging of radioactive particles. This isn't lined up. Here we go. Scavenging is most effective below about 30,000 feet, the maximum height of most rain and snow clouds. See figure 6.4. Because the Soviets have deployed thousands of ICBMs with warheads of only 100 to 550 kilotons, Americans face increased danger from very radioactive particles scavenged by rainouts or snowouts. The resultant hotspots of fallout heavy enough to kill and shelter people in a few weeks could be scattered even hundreds of miles downwind from areas of multiple explosions, especially missile fields. Prudent Americans, even those living several hundred miles from important targets, whenever practical, should equip their shelters with adequate ventilating pumps and dust filters. This potential danger from extremely small fallout particles will be worsened if the United States deploys mobile ICBMs such as Midgetmen, probably on large military reservations in the West. The Soviet Union already has mobile ICBMs in its nuclear forces. In the event of a Soviet attack, our hard-to-target mobile missiles probably would be subjected to a barrage of relatively small warheads airbursted so as to blanket their deployment areas. The resultant large clouds of extremely small radioactive particles in the troposphere usually would be blown eastward and result in life-endangering hotspots from rainouts and or snowouts could be scattered clear to the Atlantic coast. Fortunately, even in many expedient shelters completed in a few days, filtered air can be provided by using a homemade KAP to pump air through furnace or air conditioning filters, as described in the last section of Appendix B. To learn how you can supply a shelter at low cost with air so well filtered that essentially all extremely small fallout particles or ineffective aerosols are removed, see Appendix E, how to make a homemade plywood double-action piston pump and filter. Okay. Okay. These worsening potential dangers from extremely small hot fallout particles brought promptly to Earth by scavenging are not likely to endanger nearly as many American lives as would 24-hour fallout of much larger particles from surface and near-surface explosions. Providing enough outdoor air to shelters rather than filtered air will continue to deserve first priority. Stopping or restricting shelter ventilation. When instrument readings or observations show that heavy fallout has begun to be deposited, shelter occupants should decide whether to restrict or stop ventilation. If it is windy outside, even some sand-like fallout particles may be blown into a shelter with large ventilation openings. However, ventilation should not be restricted long enough to cause weaker occupants to be on the verge of collapse from overheating or to result in headaches from exhaled carbon dioxide. If a house is burning dangerously close to a separate earth-covered shelter, closing the shelter's ventilation openings for an hour or two usually will prevent the entry of dangerous concentrations of carbon dioxide, or smoke. Most houses will burn to the ground in less than 2 hours. They go into that more in the next chapter, by the way, in chapter 7, about fires and things like that. So, when an attack is expected, a shelter occupied or soon to be occupied should be kept as cool as practical by pumping large volumes of outdoor air through it when the outdoor air is cooler than the shelter air. This will also assure that the air is fresh and low in exhaled carbon dioxide. Then if a need arises to stop or restrict ventilation, the shelter can be closed for longer than could be done safely otherwise. Ventilation and cooling of permanent shelters. A permanent family fallout shelter built to moderate cost before a crisis should have a ventilation system that can supply adequate volumes of either filtered or unfiltered air, pumped in through an air intake pipe and out through an air exhaust pipe. Provision also should be made for the grim possibility that the fallout could be so heavy that a shelter might have to be occupied for weeks or even part-time for months. A small or medium-sized permanent shelter should be designed so that most of the time after an attack, it can have adequate natural ventilation through its entryway, emergency exit. During hot spells, forced ventilation through the same large air passageways should be provided by using a homemade KAP. This manual air pump, described in Appendix B, can force large volumes of air through low resistance openings with minimum effort. Ways to ventilate and cool permanent shelters are described in Chapter 17, Permanent Family Fallout Shelters for Dual Use, and in Appendix E, How to Make and Use a Homemade Plywood Double Action Piston Pump and Filter. I'll probably go ahead and build that as well, since I'm covering this whole book, so I'll get to that later. But, okay. Warning, many official instructions for building and ventilating shelters are life-endangering. The reader is advised not to read the section if pressed for time during a crisis unless he is considering building an expedient or permanent shelter described in the official civil defense publication. Because of the worldwide extremes, fear of radiation, civil defense specialists who prepare official self-help instructions for building shelters have made radiation protection their overriding objective. Apparently, the men in Moscow and Washington who decide what shelter building and shelter ventilating instructions their fellow citizens receive, especially instructions for building and improving expedient shelters, did not understand the ventilation requirements for maintaining endurable temperature, humidity conditions in crowded shelters. It must be remembered that shelters may have to be occupied continuously for days in warm or hot weather. Russian small expedient shelters are even more dangerously underventilated and are most of the American counterparts, and can serve to illustrate similar ventilation deficiencies of American shelters. Figure 6.5 is a Russian drawing with its caption translated of a wood earth shelter in a Soviet self-help civil defense booklet. Anti-radiation shelters in rural areas. This booklet, published in a 200,000 copy edition, includes illustrated instructions for building 20 different types of expedient shelters. All 20 of these shelters have dangerously inadequate natural ventilation, and none of them have air pumps. Note that this high protection factor covered trench shelter depends on air flowing down through its dust filter with straw packing hay, and out through its small exhaust duct with damper. As part of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory's participation in Defense Nuclear Agency's dice throw 1978 blast test, I built 2 Russian pull-covered trench shelters. These were like the shelter shown in figure 6.5, except that each lacked a trapdoor and filter. As anticipated, so little air flowed through these essentially dead-ended test shelters That temperature soon became unbearable. And there's a picture of that, figure 6.5. So wood earth shelter without lining of the walls for clay soils, 10 occupants. There's a trapdoor, dust filters with straw packing, hay, earth covered, 60 to 80 centimeters thick, roofing made of poles, exhaust ducts over here with damper, curtain, where is it? A curtain, made of tightly woven cloth, removable container for waste, water collecting sump. Bill of materials is rough lumber, 2.7 cubic meters, nails, 0.12 kilogram, wire, 0.64 kilogram, work requirement, 90 to 110 man hours, shielding coefficient 250 to 300. Okay. Russian earth-covered expedient fallout shelters are based on military dugouts designed for brief occupancy during a conventional attack. Subsequently, they were improved for fallout protection. But were made much less hospitable by Soviet civil defense specialists. Apparently, these specialists were ignorant of ventilation requirements, and almost certainly they did not field test small expedient fallout shelters for habitability. Tens of millions of Russians have been taught to build such shelters. Once any bureaucracy issues dangerously faulty equipment or instructions, it rarely corrects them except under pressure. I have experienced the reluctance, even during wartime when trying to improve faulty combat equipment, that was causing American soldiers to lose their lives. Continuing proofs of such bureaucratic reluctance to correct dangerous errors in hundreds of thousands of potentially life-endangering civil defense pamphlets and booklets, especially the several editions of In Time of Emergency, kept nationwide in hundreds of communities, primarily for crisis distribution. Some American official instructions for building expedient shelters have been slowly improved over the decades. The best are given in the June 1985 edition of Protection of the Nuclear Age, one of the FEMA widely available free booklets. Yet even in this improved edition, no mention is made of a crucial need for forced ventilation during warm weather, nor for expedient simple means for providing pumped air. Also in the June 1985 edition of Protection of the Nuclear Age, the second crawlway entry-exit of the above-ground door-covered shelter, see Appendix A4, is replaced by a 4 to 6 DIA pipe for ventilation, which makes this very small, thinking he's saying 4 to 6 inch diameter pipe for ventilation, which makes this very small shelter essentially dead-ended and thereby eliminates adequate ventilation in warm weather. With only a 6-inch diameter air exhaust opening, not nearly enough air can flow naturally in warm weather through this crowded shelter's room, only about 39 inches wide by 34 inches high. As provided by habitability tests of Florida and elsewhere, a KAP or directional fan must be used, even with 2 crawlway entry exits. Okay, this isn't crazy long, so I'll go ahead and cover those other 2 pages. All right. The essential second crawlway entry-exit of the above-ground door shelter was eliminated as a result of a recommendation by a contractor for FEMA charged with field testing and evaluating expedient shelters and improving abbreviated shelter building instructions. No habitability tests were required. So the contractor concluded in his 1978 report to FEMA that the second entry exit should be eliminated because the building of entries is time consuming, and with a small shelter, a second entry is really not justified. In peacetime, bureaucracies of all nations tend to divide up responsibilities between specialists and to promote means by which non-prestigious wartime problems can apparently be solved within the least expensive work. Directional fanning to ventilate shelters. The directional fanning instructions on the following 2 pages may save more lives than any other instructions given in this book for the home-makeable survival item. I regret that no one rediscovered this pre-mechanization symbol. I regret that no one rediscovered this pre-mechanization simple, yet effective way of manually pumping air until after the original nuclear war survival skills was published. In 1980, Dr. William Olson, a NASA research engineer long concerned with improving self-help civil defense, rediscovered one kind of directional fanning. Since then, with the assistance of able Americans and others, I designed and field-tested several types of directional fans. I have field-tested and repeatedly improved the instructions to enable average people to quickly learn how to make and use such fans effectively. The great advantage of directional fanning is that almost anyone who is given the field-tested instructions can quickly make and use one of these simple fans. Only very widely available materials are needed. The main disadvantage is that the directional fanning is a more laborious way to ventilate a shelter than using KAPs, as described in detail in Appendix B. Americans are not likely to receive directional fanning instructions from FEMA. FEMA's predecessors, the Office of Civil Defense and the Defense Civil Preparedness Agency, were unable to get the millions of dollars necessary to buy factory-made KAPs and other manual air pumps to ventilate officially designated fallout shelters, and FEMA has avoided shelter ventilating controversies. No widely available official American publication includes instructions for making and using expedient air pumping devices. An air pumping device. Thanks to Congressman Ike Skelton, Democrat of Missouri and strong civil defense advocate, in 1981, I was able to demonstrate directional fanning to Louis Giuffrida, at that time the director of FEMA. I gave directional fans to the FEMA specialists concerned with shelter ventilation, all of whom have since left FEMA. To date, although directional fanning instructions have been reproduced in 3 private civil defense publications and some 600 copies of the metric version of the instructions were distributed to British civil defense professionals at the 1984 annual study of civil defense and emergency planning officers. FEMA has not been evaluated, even evaluated directional fanning. In contrast, in 1981, I gave copies of instructions for both KAPs and directional fans to Dr. Yin Zixu, the director of the People's Republic of China's National Research and Defense Institute of Civil Defense. And the next day, he started evaluating these simple devices. At that time, I was traveling extensively in China as an official guest, exchanging civil defense information. Dr. Yin, who heads all Chinese civil defense research and development, went with his top ventilation and shelter design specialist to a furniture factory in Beijing. There I watched a workman quickly build both a large and small KAP and also directional fans. Then Dr. Yin and his specialist began using the air velocity meters to measure the volumes of air that these simple devices could pump. On the following days, I participated in more ventilation tests using KAPs and directional fans in tunnel blast shelters in Beijing and in the port city of Dalian. While watching these top Chinese civil defense professionals make and test KAPs and directional fans, I kept thinking, this is the way Thomas Edison and Henry Ford would have evaluated simple devices of possible great importance to millions. The reader is urged to keep the following 2 pages of directional fanning instructions ready for reproduction in a crisis. This section on a small 2-handed directional fan and the large one-man fan will be the most useful to unprepared people. Ventilation by pairs of men using bedsheet fans is an effective method for forcing very large volumes of outdoor air through the tunnel corridors and mines with ceilings at least 9 feet high, provided they have 2 large openings. However, this method requires organization and discipline. I changed my mind. I'm going to cover these 2 pages in a separate video because I think they are really super important. So I'm going to dedicate another video to that. So I'll do that next. It's only 2 pages, so yeah. Okay, so I'll do that next, and then I'll cover chapter 7 after that, which is protection against fire and carbon monoxide. So yeah, okay, that's it for now. Again, this is the Nuclear War Survival Skills book by Cresson H. Kearny with authorization from Skyhorse Publishing. Okay, that's it for now, and